Hello and welcome to ORF Studios on the sidelines of the Raisina dialogue, and we are here with Martina Francesca Ferracane. She is a researcher. She wears multiple hats. She is a researcher with the European Center for International Political Economy. She is also pursuing her PhD from University of Hamburg, and she spends, I think, these days most of her time in the US. And she works on a very interesting subject, which is a topic of, which is a main topic of one of, I think, one of the themes that we have this year at the Raisina: disruption, digital trade, and cross-border data flows. And we are going to have a conversation about some of the issues that pertain to India, Europe, and the larger digital space. Martina, your work by and large looks at digital trade and cross-border data flows. And if you're looking at it primarily from the perspective of Europe, what are 3 or 4 salient things that you would like to tell our audiences here in India, perhaps?
Yeah, thanks for having me here. Actually, at ESIP, we've looked a lot into digital trade restrictions all over the world. We looked at 64 countries, and we have done also a database which collects all these kind of restrictions on digital trade. And looking at these restrictions across the board, what we noticed is first of all, that there are many more restrictions than we thought there were on digital trade. We often think that there are not restrictions and digital trade is not regulated, but actually is heavily regulated. And there are both new restrictions on digital trade, but also old, more traditional restrictions, which now become a restriction also for digital trade. For example, on copyright or certain payments rules, on migration, etc. And what is important in this regard is that most of these measures are not yet into FTAs, not negotiated in free trade agreements. So there are a lot of restrictions, and they are not taken into account, not in FTAs and neither at the WTO level. So I think that's quite relevant. And perhaps another thing that we found out from this analysis is that most of the restrictions are in developing countries. And we do see restrictions also in developed economies in the EU, in the US, but most of the restrictions are coming from developing and especially emerging economies. And it's quite telling because these economies are those that are growing the most, and they will have a say in the way in which the future of trade is going to be. So if these economies are imposing so many restrictions, we might see other countries following towards in the same path.
So what are the fundamental divides? Because you have as you point out, you have written about China's digital trade policy as well. Mm-hmm. Looked at that. You have looked at the larger global space as well. So what, in terms of if you are comparing Western or developed world's perspective on these issues, mm-hmm. vis-a-vis the emerging powers, which have a stake in how the norms evolve, yeah. What are 2 or 3 fundamental differences that you see, and whether it is possible to bridge that gap?
Yeah. I think what is relevant here is that we are seeing a kind of battle between developed economies which see the digital trade as an offensive interest versus other economies which are looking at it like a defensive interest and trying to have a policy space to make sure that in the future they can negotiate some opening up in this area. So when I'm talking with the governments, especially in developing countries, I see this really as a matter of keeping policy space and make sure that these issues profoundly and deeply understood before these countries are willing to take commitments or opening up in this area. And when it comes to China, the situation is quite special because China is the biggest economy in the world now, and the issue there is also a national security issue. China has decided to create a sort of closed internet, which is not even, I would call it an intranet within China. Is a decision which I think is legitimate for a country to take. Is like the internet was created as one single thing, but no one has has any power to decide how it should develop. And I think it's reasonable for countries to decide to take a different path, as long as they are willing to take also the consequences of this, which is basically being kind of isolated from connection with the rest of the world, communication, and making also use of services provided from other countries, etc. So yeah, I think the Chinese situation is quite special, and some countries are looking at China as an example to follow in the developing world. And this might be problematic because this was kind of a success for China, given how huge the market is, and but it's going to be hard to replicate in smaller economies. And probably for any other economy would be impossible to replicate and follow the Chinese example.
But this is extremely paradoxical, because you have a global public space. I mean, and that we initially envisioned digital space is going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if countries are now saying that, look, because of certain national security considerations, we are going to build this firewall around it, and we are going to therefore make it very difficult to have cross-border,
Mm-hmm.
engagements, then the possibility of policymakers, of researchers to look at this as a global public space shrinks. So, do we then come to a conclusion that this is going to be a trend that is going to escalate? Because then you might, if China is the largest emerging market or country is good doing this, then there'll be some repercussions in the developed world as well. And how long can Europe or the West or America continue with this idea that, look, this is an open public space? So will there be some repercussions on that front?
Yeah, I think we are going to see. It's not easy to tell how the development are going to be in the sense and which track countries are going to decide to follow. I think that the situation in which we are is also partly a result of the fact that we went into the digital world very quickly, without often taking into account the consequences in terms of cybersecurity, national security, and countries now feel themselves completely exposed to something new without fully understanding it. So I think that we should start having a clear, open discussion on what are the consequences of having an economy which is fully digitalized, and be very open about also consequences on work, on labor, on our industries, on the reskilling that is needed, and also making sure that people that lose a job find a new job in other sectors, and also be very clear and open on consequences for cybersecurity and national security. And only after we have an open, clear debate about it, then we can expect the countries would respond openly and accept this kind of open, free internet. Until then, I think it's going to be hard to expect countries to just follow suit.
But is that conversation happening in Europe at this point? Because Europe is also going through, certain parts of Europe are going through this backlash against globalization.
Mm-hmm.
So is this conversation beginning to happen, that, look, we imagined this to be an open space, we imagined it to be a win-win situation. Now there are countries that are using, because using it in ways that were perhaps not positive for us, and this is a conversation that you see, for example, happening in the manufacturing sector today.
Yeah.
in the Western world. So is this conversation that is happening in Europe?
It's interesting because, of course, there are interests, and when it comes to manufacturing, there are interests to keep the benefits of digitalization within Europe, and there is also like this Industry 4.0 movement, which is about developing the industrial sector in Europe, and there's also a kind of initiative which to me looks very close-minded. It's about the EU. There was also talks about the European cloud, etc., which on one hand is good because we are trying to liberalize manufacturing and also movement of data within the EU. Also is bad because it's creating a kind of border at the EU level. And I think in the EU we're not having enough discussions about opening up to the rest of the world. And also in Europe we see a lot of resistance against digitalization, especially because people are concerned with the privacy, security, and there are also issues with the cybersecurity and possible attacks on infrastructure. There are now new proposals on screening investment and screening import of certain digital products. So the discussion there is not really clearly for an open internet, but definitely among the international actors, the EU will be one of those which are most open to this kind of solution.
And finally, before we conclude, can you, I know you have not looked at Indian digital space that deeply perhaps that you look at other areas, but I would like you to just comment on the possibility of India taking which side of this divide, because there are questions about India's positioning as a defender of liberal order. Mm-hmm. And if that is the case, then you would see a country taking a slightly different position that perhaps China has taken. Yeah. But there are, on the other side, there can be equally valid considerations, as you pointed out, on national security. Perhaps, we in India face a very difficult national security environment for ourselves. Mm-hmm. So we can almost take the China route. So what assessment would you do sitting here in Delhi, having conversations with people who share your research agenda, where India might go in the coming years and decades?
Yeah. I think that with India is interesting because we have seen on one hand some policies which are quite restrictive for public procurement, And for example, emails that are sent from public procurement offices for public offices have to be stored and processed within India. So there are restrictions on movement of data when it comes to national security considerations. On the other hand, India still has a quite open framework when it comes to data flows and also movement of services cross-border. Which is also, I think, one of the reasons why India has managed to succeed in exporting a lot of services, online services. So I think the issue is trying to clarify what are the implications of having a free flow of data on national security and cybersecurity, and perhaps clarify some concerns on how restricting movement of data does or does not actually help national security. And once these concerns are addressed, I think India can definitely decide to lift certain restrictions that are now in place and follow the path of having an internet space, free and open internet space. And I think that India is very well positioned, especially given that there are not going to be any restrictions on censorship, filtering, and other kind of issues which are more happening in other countries. So yeah, I see most probably India following a different path than other emerging economies.
So as you rightly point out, this is a work in progress. These are still early days, and I think more power to you and other researchers who are working in this field. And also, I think the paradox that you have pointed out is very interesting, that we are looking at the common global spaces which should remain free and open, but perhaps there are considerations which are preventing states from taking that stance at this point. Yeah. So I think the best thing would be to have more conversations within states and across states, intrastate, which perhaps can bridge this divide, if at all, to the extent that it is possible.
Yeah, and this is going to bring benefits to all the economies at the end. Just having a clear conversation, then benefiting from the internet and from digital trade.
So more power to conversations, and thank you so much, Martina.
My pleasure.